Hello everyone, welcome back. Today I want to talk to you guys a little bit about Islamic slavery. Um, in the United States, usually when we talk about slavery, our focus tends to be on our very short history. Okay, we had slavery in the United States for about 165 years, um, but and that tends to be the focus. And if we look at all of the Americas, right, from the time that the Europeans came over, perhaps we had 3 centuries, 300 years of slavery. But if you look at Islamic slavery, that lasted for 13 centuries, okay, roughly 1,300 years, and some will still argue that it exists today. Now, one of the things I want to make you guys aware of is that Islamic slavery was far more brutal to black people than American slavery was. Okay, and I'm not saying that American slavery was nice, but I'm just saying that Islamic slavery was far more brutal. Okay, um, in Islamic slavery, what was customary is when they took black slaves, they castrated them. Okay, and when women were taken as slaves, they were usually used as sex slaves, and any infants or babies that they had were killed. Okay, so black slaves were not allowed to reproduce. There was no benefit of it because basically is the Islamic countries were so close to Africa that it was a lot cheaper for them to go on raids to the south and take more black slaves, as opposed in the Americas. Okay, basically, it was a lot more expensive to bring the slaves here. It took a lot more effort to bring the slaves here, and there was also import restrictions on bringing more slaves to the United States that increase their value, basically. Okay, if you want to look at it in terms of economics, okay, by virtue of the fact that it was more difficult to bring slaves all the way from Africa to the United States, and due to import restrictions, slaves were basically valued more. And what that meant is that they had to they would take better care of them because they didn't want something valuable dying off on them. Okay, and furthermore, it was to the benefit of the owners to have these slaves reproducing. Okay, so for that reason, in the United States, when we had slavery, most plantations maintained the family structure. They generally tried not to break up families, even when they sold off slaves. They tried to keep the families together because they would get more slaves out of them, as opposed to trying to buy slaves. In Africa, the opposite was true. Okay, they did not care for breeding new slaves in a family structure because it was cheaper to just go to war, or go on go on a raid to the south and take more slaves. So for that reason, like I said, it was very brutal, and usually at least 80% of the slaves would die on their way to the market. Okay, they would march them through the desert. The conditions were just horrible. And I'm not saying that, don't misunderstand this to mean that slavery in the United States was by any means fun, or easy. It was hard, but in the United States, they wanted them alive. Okay, they wanted them healthy, because they were hard. I'm not saying they were doing it out of the kindness of their heart. They were doing it because they were harder to replace. Whereas in Africa, because it was a lot easier to just replace them. The owners really didn't care about the welfare or the health of the slaves, and this really isn't, like I said, this is mostly an economic issue, because if we look at Rome, for example, okay, you had, let's say, the Romans took slaves. That was part of their business plan, really. When they went to Spain, okay, and they took slaves. In Spain, they had huge mining operations. That's where they got a lot of the metals from, in Spain. So they would basically capture Spaniards, throw them in the mines, and they would work the Spaniards to death. Okay, without regard, because they were easy to replace. Okay, so they would just work them to death, without any regard for their health. As opposed to, let's say, slaves that were back in Rome, okay, because now they're further away from the battlefield. It took greater efforts to get them there. These slaves in Rome, or other large cities, were generally better taken care of. Okay, they were deemed more valuable. Okay, so this is really a matter of economics. The closer to the battlefield the slaves are, the less valuable they are. Okay, because they're easier to replace. The further away that the slaves are from the battlefield, the more valuable they become. And that's an important concept here. That in the ancient world, who was who was free and who was slave was just a question of who won or lost the last war. Okay, you win the war, you take slaves. You lose the war, you become a slave. Okay, that was the ancient world. Like I said, I'm just putting this out there for something for you guys to look into, to research, to become familiar with. Because I find it to be a very interesting historical topic. And one of the problems in the United States is when we talk about slavery, we just focus on our short history, okay? Which is basically just a drop in time. If you want to understand slavery, look at the entire history of slavery. Another thing that I've seen happen in the United States that I think is very odd is that over the last, let's say, 50, 60 years, a lot of black people here have changed their religion from Christianity to Islam because they feel that Christianity, in the United States had condoned or was accepting or didn't fight hard enough against slavery. Okay, but they do this without realizing that that Islam was way more harsh towards black slaves. In fact, the Muslims had a policy. Basically, they had Islam is divided into two houses: a house of peace and a house of war. Okay, in the house of peace, which is lands that they control, basically, in those lands, the non-Muslims pay a tax to the Muslims. Okay, in the lands of war, which is lands that they don't control, they are free to make war and take slaves. So for this reason, the Muslims had a policy of not actually conquering lands to the south, because if they had conquered them and converted them into slaves, then they would not be able to take slaves, because basically it's against the Muslim religion for one Muslim to enslave another Muslim. So they needed to keep those they needed to keep those black people to the south as non-Muslims, so that they can continue to enslave them. Okay, so basically that was some strategic planning on their part. So like I said, I find it a little odd that a lot of black people in this country have changed their religion from Christianity to Islam because they think that that Christianity didn't do enough to protect them from slavery, while on the other hand, Islam was especially harsh to black slaves in Africa. So, like I said, something for you guys to look more into. If you got any thoughts, comments, please post it in the comment section. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you're not a member of my channel, subscribe. I'll see you guys next time.